Have you ever wondered what it truly costs to be the one everyone depends on? It's a quiet price, not loud or dramatic like betrayal in the movies. It's slow, like the drip of a faucet in the middle of the night, wearing you down drop by drop until one day you realize you're empty. Not because you gave too much, but because you were never allowed to stop giving. In the fall of 1979, I sat by the window of my penthouse apartment overlooking a rainy Manhattan skyline. My name is Clara Donnelly. For most of my life, the world saw me as a star, graceful on stage, poised on screen, generous in silence. But what no one saw was the story unfolding behind that polished smile. The story of what it means to be the golden child, the provider, the emotional anchor in a family that confused love with entitlement. In my hands that evening was a letter from my younger brother. A final request, it said. But I already knew. It wouldn't be the last. Not really. Because when you've spent your whole life being the safety net, people forget you're human too. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd catch them when they fell. They used to say I was born with stars in my eyes. By the time I was 22, I had already graced the cover of Vanity Fair, danced across Broadway stages in gowns stitched with gold thread, and learned to smile through the exhaustion of 5 a.m. call times and champagne galas that never ended. Before midnight, fame came early, not because I chased it, but because it seemed to chase me. I was Clara Donnelly, America's rising icon of the 1970s. But behind the glitz and grace was a girl who learned very young that applause means nothing if the people closest to you never clap. At home in Queens, my parents were proud. Proud. In the way you're proud of a lottery ticket that keeps paying out. My mother used to joke, "We should have named you Lucky." And perhaps she was right. They were ordinary people living in a weathered townhouse with crooked blinds and fading wallpaper, and I brought them something they never had before. Attention, opportunity, and money. I paid off their mortgage by 24, quietly, without ceremony. Just a wire transfer and a voicemail from my father that said, "Good job, Clara. We got the confirmation." Then there was Teddy, my younger brother by 3 years. Reckless, charming, magnetic in that way that makes women forgive and men excuse. He flunked out of college twice, declared himself a painter, then an actor, then a nightclub promoter, all funded, of course, by what I made under stage lights. He'd call in the middle of my rehearsals saying things like, "Sis, I just need a little help to get through the month," or, "It's not alone if you love me, right?" His voice always had that softness, that calculated vulnerability, that made it hard to say no. And I rarely did. No one ever told him to get a job. No one ever asked where the money went. Meanwhile, I learned to recite my lines between appointments with lawyers, agents, and accountants, juggling scripts with bank statements, choreographing a life that somehow made room for everyone else's mess. I told myself it was my duty. I was the eldest, the provider, the one who made it out and had to reach back. But somewhere in the shadows of the spotlight, I became something else entirely. An answer, a resource, a walking checkbook that never asked questions. I remember the moment it hit me. It was after a sold-out performance of Ivory and Ashes at the Majestic. I was still in costume, still in that hazy post-show daze, when my manager handed me a note. Not a bouquet, not a fan letter. Just a folded scrap of paper that read, "Teddy needs $10,000. Urgent." There was no signature, no thank you, just the expectation, casual and cold. That was the moment I began to realize. The family I loved so fiercely might not have loved me back in the same way. Or at least, not for who I was, but for what I gave. And I couldn't help but wonder, how long had I been performing for them? 2? It didn't happen all at once. That realization, the one where you start to see your own story not as a beautiful sacrifice, but as a quiet surrender. For years, I convinced myself that what I was doing was noble. That paying my brother's rent for the third time, or wiring emergency funds for a sudden plumbing issue at my parents' house, or covering Teddy's gallery launch party, complete with imported hors d'oeuvres and a string quartet, was just part of being successful. I was told, gently and often, that I was the glue that held everyone together, that my success was our success, and I wanted to believe that. I needed to. But in reality, I was the only one trying to hold anything up at all. While my peers bought lake houses and traveled to Capri with lovers and entourages, I quietly put off personal vacations, canceled fittings, and downsized 2 of my staff just so I could keep sending money home. I told myself it was temporary, that Teddy would finally find his footing, that one of his startups would turn profitable. But he didn't find footing. He found a net, and I was the one holding it open. I remember a moment in late '76, just after a long shoot in Savannah. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, barely holding it together as I stepped into my Manhattan loft. My assistant, Monica, handed me a stack of mail, but one envelope was already open. She looked uneasy. "Your mother called while you were on set," she said. "They need help covering the tax bill again." Again. That word haunted me. It was never a new crisis. It was always another repetition of the same careless pattern. I had sent over $40,000 that year alone, and the only thank you I'd received was a voicemail that started with, "You didn't answer fast enough, Clara." Still, I sent more. I think what hurt most wasn't the money. It wasn't even the imbalance. It was the complete invisibility of my effort. When I funded the roof repairs on my childhood home, my mother told neighbors, "A nice man from the insurance company finally came through." When Teddy's gallery held its first and only opening night, he gave a speech thanking friends, fate, and good luck. I watched from the corner, hidden behind oversized sunglasses and a carefully practiced smile. Not once did he look in my direction. And yet, when the power bill came due, or a shipment of wine glasses went missing, my phone rang. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing that your generosity has become expected, that no one remembers when you gave, only the one time. You don't. I'd walk into family gatherings with thoughtful gifts, only to be greeted by questions like, "Did you bring the check?" Or "Is it true you're making $500,000 this season? Must be nice." There was no curiosity about my life, only a hunger for what I could provide. I started to feel like a strange sort of ghost, visible only when money was needed, invisible the rest of the time. Once, during a rare quiet dinner with my father, I brought up the idea of taking a year off, of finally traveling, maybe writing a book. He blinked, confused. "What would you even write about?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Your life's been pretty easy, hasn't it?" That single sentence lodged itself in my ribs like a splinter. Easy. The years of training, the heartbreaks I never shared, the deals I negotiated in back rooms filled with cigar smoke and dismissive men, all reduced to a shrug. That was the night I stopped seeing them as a family I was protecting, and began seeing them for what they had become. People who were comfortable asking for everything, yet incapable of offering anything in return. But I still wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Because somewhere deep inside me, that little girl from Queens still hoped that one more wire transfer, one more rescue, one more nod of support would finally earn me their love. And it's dangerous, the things we tell ourselves when the people we love refuse to love us back properly. It was early spring of 1977 when everything began to shift, subtly at first, like a painting that looks different only when you stare too long. I had just returned from a grueling film shoot in Marfa, Texas, where the heat had melted more than my makeup. I was bone-tired, every inch of me aching from a role that demanded I embody a woman who loses everything, ironically fitting. I arrived back in Manhattan to find a message waiting for me at the front desk of my building. It was handwritten, rushed, and folded 3 times. Call home. Urgent. Teddy. That word, urgent, always carried weight, but I'd learned it rarely meant what it claimed. I called anyway. My mother answered, voice thick with panic. Clara, your brother's in trouble. He was at some protest. Things got out of hand. There's talk of charges, resisting arrest, damage to property. He needs a lawyer, a good one. I could already hear it. Beneath her words, the unspoken. You're the only one who can fix this. I closed my eyes. How much? I asked. A pause. 15,000, maybe more. Can you wire it by tonight? I was supposed to have a meeting that afternoon with a woman from the National Theater Fund. She had been waiting months for an audience with me to discuss a project close to my heart, an art scholarship for underprivileged girls. I canceled it. I wired the money. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from guilt, not from stress, but from something worse. Resignation. I lay there wondering how many more times this would happen. How many more dreams I would postpone because Teddy had once again thrown himself into chaos and expected me to sweep up the pieces. The next morning, over coffee, my financial manager Gregory arrived for our regular quarterly meeting. He was a tall, sharp-eyed man who never used dramatic words unless absolutely necessary. But that day, his tone was cautious. Clara, he said, flipping through a small leather folder, I wanted to bring something to your attention. It's sensitive. I glanced up, a quiet nod. He laid down the report. In the past 18 months, there have been 36 transfers to your family's household. That totals just over $120,000. I froze. That can't be right. It is, he said gently. And it's not including what you've paid directly, mortgage coverage, Teddy's gallery lease, the studio, redesign in Queens. He paused. May I ask, does anyone else contribute financially in your family? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd that laughter was the only shield I had left. No, I said softly. It's just me. He nodded slowly. Then perhaps it's time to consider whether the support you're offering is helping or enabling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. His words clung to me like fog for the rest of the week. Was I helping? Or enabling? That question echoed every time my phone buzzed with another request, another favor disguised as love. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The way Teddy always wore new designer shoes, the art supplies that never came from discount stores, the trips he bragged about taking to clear his mind in Montauk. All of it, paid for by me. And yet, the one time I asked for his help, moving furniture into my new place, he showed up 2 hours late and left after 15 minutes, claiming he had a migraine from emotional stress. I began to see the pattern clearly. It wasn't love I was receiving. It was convenience. I was the backstage crew to their lives, invisible but essential. But even the best actresses grow tired of pretending, and somewhere deep in me, a thought began to form, dangerous, delicate, but impossible to ignore. What if I just stopped? I didn't stop all at once. People like me rarely do. We ease into our exits, testing the door before stepping through. But that spring, after Gregory's quiet confrontation and my own building unrest, I decided to take a detour. I told my mother I'd be in Los Angeles for reshoots. That was a lie. Instead, I went back to Queens, unannounced, unscheduled, unfiltered. I hadn't been inside the old family house in over a year. I used to romanticize it. The creaky floors, the faded floral wallpaper, the smell of lemon oil and old books. But when I pulled up in the rented car and saw a sleek cherry-red Jaguar parked in the driveway, something in me cracked. The Jaguar was Teddy's. There was no mistaking it. Custom plate, new tires, waxed to a showroom shine. I stepped out slowly, heels clicking on the uneven pavement. The curtains twitched in the living room window before I even rang the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened and my mother stood there in her silk robe. It was 2 p.m. "Clara," she said, blinking like I'd risen from the dead. "We thought you were out of town." She didn't invite me in, but I walked past her anyway. Inside, the house was unrecognizable, not because it had changed, but because I had. Teddy was sprawled on the couch, laughing into a phone. He looked up at me with mild surprise, then irritation. "You could have called," he muttered. I stared at him for a moment, at his tailored shirt, the gold watch on his wrist, the glass of wine on the coffee table. My voice didn't rise. "Nice car," I said. He shrugged. "Lease." I turned to my mother. "You said he was struggling, that he needed legal help." She waved a hand dismissively. "He did, darling, but we figured it out." My eyes narrowed. "With what money?" Silence. Then, my mother folded her arms. "Don't act like it's a big deal. You've always had more than enough." I could hardly believe it. My stomach twisted. "So you lied?" She looked wounded. "We didn't lie. We just didn't tell you everything. Besides, helping your brother is helping the family." That phrase again. Helping the family. A phrase that meant, empty your pockets, Clara, and don't ask questions. I stared at the two of them, my brother who had never worked a full-time job in his life, and my mother who had once told me I was born to take care of others. Suddenly, all I could feel was cold. "Did you use my money for that car?" I asked quietly. Teddy rolled his eyes. "You're overreacting. It's not even in your name." I almost laughed. That's exactly the problem. Then came the part that burned. My mother placed her hand on my shoulder and said with perfect calm, "You have a gift, Clara. Don't taint it with resentment. It's your role to help. You were born lucky." I stepped back. That word again, lucky. Not talented, not hardworking, not human. Just lucky. As if everything I built was a cosmic accident that required endless repayment. I felt the heat rise in my throat, but I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked to the door, and left. Back in my car, I sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. That visit had been my quiet test, my last flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd been wrong. That their love had simply been misguided, not transactional. But now I knew. I wasn't family. I was a benefactor, and that thought didn't break me. It freed me. In the days that followed, I didn't make a grand announcement. There was no dramatic speech, no ultimatum scrawled in ink. I simply stopped. I stopped sending the weekly transfers. I stopped answering every late-night phone call. I stopped pretending that love was measured by how many zeros I could attach to a wire. At first, the silence felt like guilt, thick and inescapable like the weight of a curtain that never lifts. But slowly, that silence began to feel like peace. Until the retaliation started. It began with the voicemails, first from my mother, soft and disappointed. "We noticed the electricity bill wasn't covered this month. Is everything all right, Clara?" Then from Teddy, "I'm in a bind. Sis, could use a little help, just this once." I deleted both. A few days later, my aunt called. Someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. Her tone was syrupy. "We're all worried about you, sweetheart. Fame's a lonely road. Don't forget who was there before the lights." I almost laughed. She'd never called when I was performing at the Royal Albert Hall or when my film won Best Ensemble. But suddenly, she remembered I existed. When the money stopped flowing, then came the backlash in public. A gossip column ran a quiet piece suggesting I had grown distant from my roots. An unnamed source claimed I had abandoned my family during a time of need. My publicist was furious. "Do you want me to issue a statement?" she asked. I shook my head. Let them talk. Because in truth, the only people who ever seemed to care about the story were the ones who'd never bothered to hear mine. But the real blow came the night Teddy crossed a line I hadn't imagined he'd dare approach. A journalist from the Herald, Tribune called, asking for a quote regarding an open letter Teddy had sent them, an emotional plea about how his celebrity sister had turned her back on her ailing parents and left him to care for them alone. My hands went cold. I asked the journalist to forward me a copy. When I read it, I felt both disgusted and betrayed, not because it was cruel, but because it was so calculated. Every sentence crafted not for truth, but for sympathy. He even quoted, "Our mother," claiming I had forgotten where I came from. The worst part? The letter ended with a line that broke me. She was born to serve herself. The rest of us were just extras in her show. That was the moment I realized Teddy didn't just misunderstand me. He resented me. I sat with that letter for hours, stared at it like it was a photo of someone I no longer recognized. My brother, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through flooded sidewalks, the young man I had bailed out of debt more times than I could count, had twisted my care into cruelty and weaponized it. But instead of reacting with fire, I responded with absence. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't return the calls. I began, slowly, to disappear. Not from the world, but from their world. I canceled my auto payments to the family home. I removed Teddy's name from the gallery lease. I left no note. And in doing so, I discovered something astonishing. They didn't fall. Not immediately. They didn't collapse without me. What they did instead was rage. I received letters, long, desperate, some scathing, some pitiful. One, from my father, read, "You've changed." Another, "This isn't the Clara we raised." I folded each one and placed them in a drawer I labeled receipts. Not out of spite, but to remind myself what I was walking away from. Because walking away wasn't easy. Not at first. Every part of me had been trained to return, to fix, to forgive. But I had begun learning a new kind of loyalty, not to others, but to myself. And for the first time in my life, I stopped apologizing for drawing the line. It was a Thursday morning when the truth finally surfaced, though in hindsight, the signs had been there for months. Little inconsistencies, missing details, unanswered questions I'd been too tired or too loyal to press. That morning, as I stirred honey into my tea and watched the sun cast pale light across my apartment floor, a manila envelope arrived at my door. No return address, no note, just my name typed in neat block letters, Clara Donnelly. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were photocopied bank statements, wire transfer logs, and a handwritten message on hotel stationery. "You need to see what they've been doing. I'm sorry." At first, I didn't understand. The statements showed an account under my father's name, one I had been wiring mortgage payments to for nearly 3 years. But then, about 8 pages in, my eyes caught something off. The last mortgage payment applied to the actual house had been 8 months ago. After that, every deposit I'd sent had been redirected to a separate account, one linked to a private business entity registered under Teddy's name. An art consulting firm, of all things, the kind that exists only on paper and for tax purposes. I sat very still. The room around me seemed to pulse. The money I'd sent for the family home, supposedly keeping it out of foreclosure, had not only gone unused, it had been rerouted behind my back to fund my brother's vanity project. The art gallery, the designer suits, the Jaguar, all of it. Paid for by my blind trust. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a theft wrapped in the language of family. I remembered the fights, the begging, the guilt-tripping voicemails from my mother. "We're drowning, Clara. the urgency in Teddy's voice. Just this once, sis. And all the while, they weren't sinking. They were siphoning. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and dialed Gregory, my financial manager. I kept my voice level. I need you to look into something for me. Quietly. Within 2 hours, he called back. Clara, it's worse than you think, he said. That account isn't just inactive. It's been used to transfer large sums to a shell company, then funneled into personal luxury purchases. I closed my eyes. Teddy? Yes. And possibly your father, too. There's no paperwork with your mother's name, but it's safe to assume she knew. I felt like someone had taken a match to everything I'd held sacred. Later that day, I sat at my writing desk and began compiling my own timeline. Every dollar, every receipt. I marked the day I canceled my foundation's launch to pay for Teddy's emergency legal fund. The month I sold off a portion of my film residuals to cover what they told me was medical debt. The weeks I ate instant soup so I could keep up appearances. I wasn't just financing a family, I was bankrolling a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat upright in bed, the envelope of documents clutched in my lap like a weapon and a wound at once. At some point, Monica, my assistant, called. Are you all right? She asked gently. Do you want me to come over? I stared, out the window at the blinking skyline. No, I whispered. I think I finally am. Because what I had, now, was proof. And not the emotional kind, the kind you second-guess when guilt creeps back in, but hard evidence. Legal, traceable, undeniable. For the first time, the story of what had happened to me wasn't just a feeling. It was a fact. But I wasn't going to scream it into microphones or take it to the tabloids. No. What they had stolen from me wasn't just money. It was my faith. And the only way to reclaim that was not through scandal. It would be through silence. And a reckoning they didn't see coming. I gave them one last chance. Not out of hope, but out of principle. I needed to know how far they'd go if confronted not with emotion, but with truth. A week after receiving the documents, I drove to Queens, back to that house I once called home, carrying nothing but a small leather folder under my arm. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want them to prepare. I wanted the answers unfiltered, the truth unmasked. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood in the threshold, startled. Clara, you look tired. I nodded. I am. I stepped inside. The air was stale, the living room too quiet, no jazz on the radio, no laughter echoing from the kitchen. Teddy appeared moments later, barefoot, a glass of red wine in hand. He wore that smug smile I had grown to dread. Back to visit the peasants? He said. I ignored it. Call Dad, I said flatly. We need to talk. We sat around the old dining table, the same one that had once held birthday cakes and late-night homework sessions. I placed the folder in the center and opened it slowly, laying out copies of the bank transfers, the shell company filings, the lease paperwork for the art gallery. No one said a word. I looked at my father first. 8 months. That's how long it's been since the mortgage was paid. I continued wiring money, thinking it was going toward the house. It wasn't. You knew that. He didn't meet my eyes. I was trying to protect the family, he muttered. My voice stayed steady. By stealing from me? Teddy leaned back, in his chair, cocky, dismissive. Don't be dramatic. It was family money. You make more than you'll ever spend. What's the difference? I turned to him, my stare ice. The difference is consent. The difference is integrity. And the difference is that you lied, he scoffed. You always act like you're some kind of martyr. Newsflash, you're not a saint, Clara. You're a spoiled actress with a guilt complex. I smiled then, not with kindness, but with finality. You're right, I said. I'm not a saint. I'm a woman who's done being used. My mother, who had stayed silent until now, finally spoke, her voice tight and sharp. If you walk away now, Clara, don't come back. Don't expect forgiveness. I turned to her, not angry, not broken, just resolute. Forgiveness for what? For trusting you? For paying your bills while you looked me in the eye and told me I was selfish? Then came the last gasp of manipulation. Teddy leaned forward, lowering his voice. If you expose this, you'll humiliate us. You'll destroy your own family. I laughed. Quietly. Bitterly. You destroyed this family the moment you decided your comfort was worth more than my dignity. And then, I stood up. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and placed one final item on the table. A document releasing me from any further legal or financial obligation tied to the family trust. I had my lawyer prepare it in advance. Sign it, I said. Or don't. It doesn't change what comes next. Teddy refused, of course. My father looked torn. My mother stared as if trying to memorize my face for the last time. I didn't linger. I walked out as quietly as I had entered, this time not waiting for someone to chase me. No one did. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a dull blue-gray. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest and empties your soul at the same time. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying anyone but myself. What they didn't know was that the confrontation wasn't for closure. It was documentation. I had already filed the necessary legal notices. The accounts were frozen, the gallery lease terminated, the mortgage payments redirected, this time to the proper lender, under new terms I would no longer be involved in, and I didn't do it to punish them. I did it to finally write the ending they refused to give me, one where I am no longer a character in someone else's survival story, but the author of my own. After that final confrontation, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply vanished, this time by design. I withdrew from every obligation I had once carried like sacred duty. I stopped shielding them, stopped explaining myself, and I poured every ounce of what remained in me into something I had delayed for far too long. My own voice. 2 months. Later, I sat down at my writing desk in the early morning light, opened a blank page, and began drafting a public editorial. Not for drama, not for revenge, but for liberation. I titled it simply, What Happens When the Good Daughter Stops Paying. It ran in the Sunday edition of the New York Times, under the guest column section, nestled between political commentary and cultural analysis. In it, I didn't name names. I didn't accuse. I told a story, not just mine, but a story echoed in so many women I'd met in dressing rooms, in producer meetings, in quiet phone calls after midnight. The story of being the responsible one, the provider, the one expected, to carry without complaint. The article went viral within hours. Messages flooded in from strangers, nurses, teachers, entrepreneurs, single mothers, immigrants. One woman wrote, "I thought I was the only one." Another said, "You didn't just tell your story, you told mine." And as I read their words, something inside me began to stitch back. Together. I had been unraveling for years quietly behind the scenes. But now, the thread was coming back, not as a noose, but as a lifeline. That week, my team and I revived the foundation I had once shelved, the Clara Initiative. This time, fully funded, no distractions, no detours. We offered mentorships, scholarships, and residencies for young women in the arts, girls who had been told to dim themselves, to delay their dreams in service of someone else's crisis. We hosted our first summit in late fall, with speakers from every corner of the creative world. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was giving pieces of myself away. I felt like I was building something bigger than me. Press came calling again, of course. Some wanted the scandal, the family drama, the betrayal headline. I declined every interview. I had said what needed to be said, in print, in silence, and most importantly, in action. Meanwhile, the calls from home slowed, then stopped. The legal filings handled themselves. My lawyer updated me once a week. Teddy, as expected, refused to sign the release. The trust was restructured regardless, with oversight now in the hands of an external board. The gallery closed. The bank. Account flagged for financial review. My mother sent one final letter, handwritten, 5 pages long. I didn't open it. I placed it, unread, into the same drawer where the rest of their guilt had been archived. But not all silence is bitter. Because in this quiet, I finally heard the sound of my own life. Uninterrupted, unmanipulated, undebated. I began waking, up without dread. I started singing again, not for a role, not for a paycheck, but for myself. I took long walks in the park without checking my phone. I danced barefoot in the living room when no one was watching. I began dating again, writing poetry again, learning to cook for the joy of it instead of the obligation of hosting others. And in those still, golden hours between dusk and nightfall, I felt something return to me. Not innocence, not trust, but sovereignty. I had been so afraid that choosing myself meant becoming selfish, but it turned out, choosing myself meant becoming whole. The world didn't end when I said no. It began. The world didn't end, but it did respond, and not always kindly. By the 3rd month of my silence, after the editorial, after the trust restructuring, after the gallery lease was terminated and the financial channels dried up, the retaliation came, not from tabloids or the public, but from the people I once called family. I received a formal letter from an attorney representing Teddy and my parents. They were suing me for emotional distress, citing abandonment, reputational damage, and financial interference. The irony nearly made me laugh. The suit didn't stand a chance. My legal team dismantled it in a matter of days. The judge dismissed the case without hearing arguments, calling it baseless and evidently retaliatory. Still, seeing my name in print, Donnelly faces lawsuit from family over broken promises, cut deeper than I'd expected. Not because I feared the judgment of strangers, but because it confirmed something I had long suspected. They didn't love me. Not really. They loved the version of me that gave without limits, without pause, without resistance. The moment I became a boundary, I became the villain. And yet, I did not flinch. I did not send an apology. I did not try to soften the blow. The truth didn't require decoration. 1 week later, a letter arrived. Not from the court, not from a journalist. This one was from Teddy himself. No envelope, just a single sheet folded messily, as if written in haste or anger. His handwriting was unmistakable, careless, slanted, uneven. You were never really family. You just bought your place at the table. And now that the money's gone, so are you. No greeting, no signature, no punctuation. I read it once, then again. And instead of crying, I framed it. I placed it above the fireplace in my new home, surrounded by art created by the very girls my foundation was helping to rise. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that walking away from manipulation is not cruelty, it's clarity. Because that line, meant to wound, only confirmed the truth I'd been living in the shadows of for years. I was never seen as a daughter or a sister. I was a function, a resource. And when a resource stops giving, the illusion of family evaporates. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't need to. I had already said everything I needed to say through my silence, my work, and the life I was rebuilding without them. But the absence did bring moments of grief. Quiet, piercing ones. Like the first birthday I spent alone, with no calls from My mother. Like the holidays, when I saw old photos on social media of the family gathered around the table I bought. Moments when doubt whispered in my ear, asking, what if they fall apart without you? What if this really was too far? And then I'd remember the night I sat in my Manhattan apartment, unable to buy myself a proper meal because I had sent every last cent to fix a leaking roof in a house I wasn't welcome in. I'd remember waking up to overdraft alerts on my phone while Teddy bought vintage wine and my mother booked weekend retreats in the Catskills. I had sacrificed everything but myself. And now that I had myself back, I was not going to surrender. Again, some people lose everything and find blame. Others lose everything and find themselves. I had done both. And in that loss, I had uncovered the most unexpected gift. Freedom, not given, not granted, but seized, earned. This wasn't the life I had imagined. It was better, because it was mine. Clara's story is more than a tale of fame and betrayal. It's a mirror for anyone who has ever been cast as the caretaker, the fixer, the one who's expected to give without limit. What she experienced isn't unique to celebrities or the wealthy. It's a pattern far too common in families around the world. When one person becomes the solution, their humanity slowly disappears. What Clara chose to do wasn't cruel. It was courageous. She didn't walk away to punish anyone. She walked away to protect what little of herself remained. And in doing so, she uncovered a powerful truth. Unconditional giving, without boundaries, becomes a form of self-erasure. Her story reminds us that love without respect is exploitation, and that sometimes the strongest form of love we can offer is to finally say no. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever reached a point where choosing yourself felt like betrayal, even when it was the only way to survive? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone because of your words. And if Clara's journey resonated with you, consider subscribing for more stories that dive deep into the heart of human relationships, where truth, healing, and power intersect.